So welcome to the Global Discussion, discussions with creatives, leaders and thinkers. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Rose Horowitz, a Pulitzer nominated journalist. Does lots of things. I'm so interested in this episode, and I'm going to ask you, Rose, to maybe introduce yourself to our worldwide audience. Tell us a little bit about your journey. Tell us what you were doing, what you're doing today, and how all that social media, audio, podcasts, events, and of course, journalism, how that is all threaded together. Over to you, Rose.
All right. Thank you. I think journey is a good way to describe my career. And I'll just start that I am Pulitzer nominated journalist for some investigative work I've done. But I started after graduate school at the Associated Press. I was about to graduate, and an editor from Pittsburgh called me and said, "Hey, well, what are you up to?" "Hey, Rose, what are you up to?" And they had a vacation relief staffer in Pittsburgh, and I lived in New York City and gone to school in the city, and flew to Pittsburgh and became the 6 a.m. to 3 a.m. shift, which meant that I was reading newspapers and listening to radio and police wires from all over in Allegheny County, which is around Pittsburgh. And by 10 or 11 and 12, for the 12 noon, we were writing for radio, for what people wanted to share on radio. I did that then in a few months in Charleston, West Virginia, which was like, that's a really different country. Never been. And it was great, fascinating. And then eventually I landed in a business newspaper in New York City called the Journal of Commerce, that was owned at the time by Knight Ridder. And I was in charge, I was covering international trade and shipping, which meant that as a young reporter, I would be sent out, and the president of Argentina was coming to the Plaza Hotel, and I would be there with, the Wall Street Journal, the Wires, the New York Times, and coming back to the office to write that up. And I love scoops, and I love, finding sources. And I began to get a lot of scoops, and then I was put on assignment for an investigative project that I can talk more about, or we can go elsewhere.
But it's fascinating, Rose, because to start off in the AP, the Associated Press, that must have been a great experience, just out of college.
Yeah, it was awesome, because I got to see, I met, photographers who had been, in wartime, this famous sports figures in Pittsburgh. We got an urgent wire about Terry Bradshaw at the time, was retiring, and I'm not a football fan. I was like, should this be an urgent? Yes. So it was great fun. It was really cool to be, in a bureau, and AP is, it's very tough. There's always a deadline, with the wire service. And then learning to write for radio too. So in an introduction to how to write broadcast.
Yeah, brilliant. And from that, what a great start to reporting, to press, to journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reporter, obviously the Journal of Commerce as a reporter, mm-hmm. You had your beat, you loved getting the scoops, and you're there with, the world's best press, right? That must have been an incredible step. You were there for quite a number of years too, weren't you?
Yeah, I was there for almost 5 years. And somewhere in the midst, I began to, I did a story about Chinese counterfeit goods. And the managing editor of the paper had been at the Philadelphia Inquirer and done some big Pulitzer prizes for reporting about ships and the ports in Philadelphia and accidents. And we got something under the mail, under the door. Okay, that was a manila blank envelope. That was somebody in the shipping business saying this other another shipping company was monopolizing all the bids for U.S. Food for Peace cargo that went out from the government, from the U.S. Agriculture Department and the U.S. Food for Peace program. And, we looked at this and he said, check it out. So that turned into a 3-month investigative report on how the bidding system worked for U.S. Food for Peace cargo, and mainly telling the story of how this one company and the way the bids were done meant that instead of all the money for U.S. Food for Peace going to Sudan to feed the hungry, some of it was ending up in these middlemen's pockets. And so I spent 3 months doing this investigation, came out in a few parts, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said, let's look at this. So they held hearings on the way the bidding went, and eventually they changed the law so that it was, instead of a closed bidding process, it became an open bidding process. And for that piece, that was nominated for a Pulitzer. I got a Associated Press award, Managing Editor's Report award, and also World Hunger Year. I got an award for that.
And that must have been incredible at the time, Rose. I mean, it sounds like a movie. The envelope was pushed under the door.
Yeah.
You had to.
And then at the last minute, the company that we were talking about that was nefarious, wrote us a letter to our lawyer saying, if you publish this, we're gonna sue you. But that was a time when I wasn't personally, I had the backing of, a big company behind me.
Yeah, incredible.
But it was dramatic. I had a deep throat source in Washington. And I would go see him. I'd call him serendipitously. I'd meet him, in a certain bar, cafe. And a few years later, I found out, he lost his job. So it's hard to, when you're a whistleblower, it's hard to keep that secret.
Yeah. And even today, whistleblowing, journalism, investigative reporting, it's probably a hotter topic now than it's ever been. It's incredible.
It does, yes, and it's really important. And maybe, as we talk about ChatGPT and how that's going to evolve, it's hard to think of how ChatGPT could have done that story. Yeah. So maybe it means that there's a bigger place for stories like that, because if a newspaper is going to use ChatGPT to generate summaries of news events or police reports or hot things coming up for the weekend, maybe they can turn that, that staffing and those hours to somebody like me who's going to really uncover things that technology can't alone. Technology can't do that alone.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let's come back to that, because I do have some questions around that. But let's bring it up to date then. You also did a bit of a beat at the Los Angeles Daily News. And now today, obviously, you work for yourself as a journalist and a writer, don't you?
Yes, I wanted to live in Los Angeles, and I was there as a West Coast correspondent for a while, and then found a job covering aerospace for the LA Daily News, which was a paper that served Santa Clarita and that northern area where Lockheed was based. And a lot of, there's a lot of aerospace companies in LA, and I got to cover a takeover battle for Lockheed. So I had, the company feeding me information, and then employees or union people, feeding me information. And, and I, again, was getting scoops, by developing sources. And it was a great beat to follow, because that's one, aside from the movie industry, I'd say, aerospace was the biggest industry in Los Angeles.
Yeah. For sure.
And then I I did some stories for Forbes and the LA Times. I did a personal column about waiting over 9 months to have a baby. And then I started freelancing and did some for the New York Times. When I moved back to Connecticut, to the East Coast, and did some for the New York Times. And then I also did some for things for American Express. I've done content for City. I did 2 travel stories that are on their Life and Money website. One's about traveling to Africa, and one's about 2 days in New York, sort of the 36-hour. So I've really had a lot of experience, doing, I've done content journalism, banking, finance, and just, you name it. I can write about it.
No, listen, it's a fascinating journey. I think that was the perfect word for it. And there must have been times where you were sort of pinching yourself, Rose, going, "Am I doing this? Is this what I do now as a journalist?"
Maybe, I guess I always wanted to be a journalist. I tell a funny story is my father had been at Variety for years, and I remember he was covering TV, and it was like very like green shaded, green pencil, and so at 10 years old, I started the Horowitz family newspaper. So I was the editor. I had I had ads and stories about what was going on in the family. I made my brother the assistant editor. So I did always love to write, and I was interested in international affairs, and so I went to the Columbia School of International Journalism, where I was able to both study international relations and study at the J School.
That's a wonderful tale. That's beautiful to hear. Running the family media empire at 10. I love that.
Yeah. Right.
Very good.
But and so I always continued to write. I have 4 children. I had 2, and then for the third I had 2. So I had a double blessing. So it was a lot of years of driving and running. But I always continued to do freelance, and also got involved in some nonprofits like in education and theater within the community, and social. And then I guess in 2013, I said, hey, I got to get on this thing called Twitter, because I saw how popular that was, and all journalists were on it. And I set up an account and loved it, because it was so much like, being a wire reporter, being, a breaking reporter. And with the phone, I discovered, great power in that phone. I was at a rally for PEN America on the front steps of the New York Public Library, huge crowd. Masha Gessen spoke about, this was after Trump was elected. So this was, and I heard a poet, Rita Dove, speak, who is, I guess she's been poet laureate for the US. And she was also been poetry editor for the New York Times Magazine. And she gave this a very impassioned speech. There was music, and I went on my phone. I recorded the video clip. And then I was able on my phone, research like what song that was, exactly what poem she was reading, and put out this clip. And it really showed you the power of social media, because suddenly hundreds of people were retweeting this and sharing it. And, I could do this all on my phone. There was no editor. I didn't actually have to have, a publication that I was sending this to at the moment, so like you can really create your own brand and media, your own media through technology.
Yeah, I love that, Rose. I was talking to a gentleman recently called Rob Montgomery, and Rob is he teaches mobile journalism, if you like. And it's interesting, you're talking about that back in, was it 2012, 2013 kind of time frame? And
when I started, and then I guess that time that I put out the tweet with the poet was 2016.
Yeah. And it is incredible, because he tells the story of, no longer did you need the satellite truck and the feeds and the camera guys and the lighting. And you're saying something very, very similar there, which is that sort of social media. It's sort of the town square. It's the pulse of what's going on in your hand, in your pocket, in your purse, in your bag. Right. So it is incredible that technology's played a part, which brings us nicely back to what you mentioned a few moments ago, which I have to come back to. We're living in a world today, and I'm going to throw 2 or 3 things at you, and I'd love you to maybe just give us your views on it and where you're at with the landscape, because there's huge turmoil when it comes to news at the moment. There's sort of 2 main sides to news. There's always the word bias that keeps coming up in today's news world, whether it's paper, newspaper, print, magazine, radio, television, social media for sure. And then you've got this sort of AI revolution that's getting better and better and better. Or is it, based on what we were talking about a moment ago, with that type of 3-month dedicated investigative journalism that you had to do? So what are your thoughts on the technology today? What are your thoughts on where we are with the news, the wider news landscape?
I think if you, the whole world of journalism turned upside down, and I'd say that started happening in the Great Recession we had, at least in the US, in like 2008, 2010. So because more publication, more sites like New BuzzFeed and Vox, and they were new media that was going only on digital and no more like legacy of the Time magazine. Now, let's say, even though it was Time, they also had a digital version, and they might do a podcast. But you had these, and it was the democratization, I think, of journalism, in that sort of anybody who could write could do what I did, let's say, at that AP, at that press, at that rally. But at the same time, there's a level of, experience that I bring to it. So that, people will say, oh, well, are you a digital native? Well, someone my age is not a digital native, but I know I've learned how to use the tools, and I bring to it judgment that not everybody will have, or somebody who picks up Chat GPT. I went back in a few years ago to be an editor of a local paper in Connecticut, to be assistant managing editor. We had six reporters, and it was like 6 o'clock, and the police called a reporter on the court beat or police beat, said, hey, there's a breaking story. There's an abandoned baby found in this grocery store. I said, oh, well, that's news. And I said to this young, reporter, send me, file something for me. And she wanted to get out of the newsroom. It was around 6, 7, and she gave me like one paragraph, and I said, well, no, this is not just a brief. Like, this is a big deal. Baby found in a. And I had to, then contact the editors at the main editing office and say, hey, put this as a front page, put this on the front page with a with a link to the story. And the next day, as I was on the way to work, NBC News in New York City was reporting this. Okay, so that's and somebody who might be adept at and know how to do all the digital stuff didn't really understand that this was a big story. So I think it's and with ChatGPT, I've been playing with it, and it gave me a haiku. I asked for a specific. I said, give me a haiku of a squirrel picking off cherry tomatoes from my porch. And it was pretty close, it was not bad. But then I also asked it to tell me 4 lines from Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay. And that didn't know how to do. So I think there's a lot of law that has to be established about copyright in both art and in creative. And, if you think about, I was talking to Liza Donnelly, cartoonist, New Yorker cartoonist, on my show, and I asked her, what do you think of this Chat GPT? I said, she said, well, I've already signed like things to try to protect my work, but it's pretty hard to be funny, in Chat GPT, to generate that. So, how do you generate a cartoon that's original based on, so I think, though, I really think everybody has to pay attention to it. And that's why I'm playing around with ChatGPT. And that's why I'm following. I just got a book on AI and the metaverse, because just like, 10 years ago, I said, oh, I have to know about Twitter, and that's Web 2. I think we have to know about Web 3 now and what that means. And we have to know about AI, because it will transform how we report and the whole media landscape.
Yeah, you've raised some important points there, Rose. Just going back to what you're saying about the experience, the knowledge, the sort of human input that comes to know, like the nose for a story. I hate to say it, but knowing that that's a story,
Right.
that the human trait in the gut that goes, no, we got to run this. And
Yeah.
there are newsrooms the world over that have the daily stand-up where they discuss what stories are going to lead, what are the stories of the day. And that's a regular practice which most people aren't aware of, that happens in
Mhm.
all the major and minor newsrooms.
Right. We
Where
would
they
have two news two what's ahead for the day, one at 11 and one at 2. And this is a newspaper, but I'm sure at MSNBC, there's dozens.
Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
you don't see that. You're right.
You don't see that. The general consumer, the person consuming the media, consuming the news output, the process is kind of hidden to some degree. And it's just fascinating when you mention the human experience and the human ability to say, actually, no, this, you should run with this. I need this to be run. And that's kind of a little quirk that happens consistently in the world of news and media behind the scenes, I think. The other thing that you mentioned is around the technology, around AI, around chat GPT. And it just seems to be getting better faster.
Yes.
But you also raise with the cartoonist Liz and the work that she does, and other artists around the world, there is something around, there's a bit of a gray line, isn't there? There's a blurring between copyright and AI generated content, art, etc. But when you say cartoons, I thought that was fascinating, because getting humor right, even for professional writers who write comedy, it is very difficult. It's very hard to write something that's funny. And
very few people do. I happen to be married to one, but does comedy for TV and other places and books.
Right.
Very few people really who make a career of that.
Yeah, and we forget,
and
don't
very
we?
few people like Liza, who has, and she's reinvented herself. We talk about, the way I've pivoted. I haven't talked about Women to Follow, so I have to do that. But, she started as a cartoonist. And when she started, she said, I was always a feminist, but I was just thinking about, there were only 4 women at the time writing cartoon, drawing cartoons. But I just wanted to get the cartoon in, I just wanted to be a cartoonist.
Yeah.
And for myself, I was in a room of men, financial analysts, and everybody was a man mostly, but I wanted to get the story, and that was my goal.
Yeah, and
so,
I know Liza would be. It's like video journalism.
Yes, so she's invented.
She can tell that story through the imagery.
So I was at a social media conference, and she's sitting there with an iPad, and suddenly I'm seeing, on Twitter, the person speaking, and she's got a caption and it's color, and she, so she just took that iPad and said, and this new technology to draw, and then to put it out instantly. So she, in a way, she's what the Wikipedia, I told her this, and she's like, really? Calls it a new form of journalism. So she, because they're always, like she said, we're always been drawing, there's always been live drawing, but now through technology, she can share that through the world. And she is the leader and become the pioneer in that. And so she then started doing for CBS News and covered the Emmys and the Oscars and the political conventions. And so even though she's like very old school in a way with her cartoons, she's pivoted and, made her career and embraced technology. And that's what I think a woman and people need to do. And that's why, yes, I think ChatGPT is scary and there are copyright issues, but I think you can't, duck your head in and say, I'm just not going to think about this. It's not going to affect me, because either I'm a poet, I'm funny, I have a, nose for news. And I know when I see a good story, you have to consider, well, can AI figure that out? I don't know. I don't think AI could have figured out that situation. But I don't know, 5 years down the road, if it will. But there still needs people there's still a need for people like myself to be able to understand it and communicate what we're doing with that AI.
Thank you, Rose. That's some great insight there. I really appreciate it. Now, obviously, you must read a lot. A lot must come across your desk.
Yeah, I just before this, I got 4 books here that I've read.
Oh, I'd love to hear that, because I was going to ask you about books that you like to read. Have you got some favorite titles, authors, genres? Are you an audio book kind of person? Do you like listening to audio? Do you prefer the written word and holding it in your hand? How does that work for you?
I prefer the book. I've done both. I've listened to a little audio, but like I kind of see my time in the car or the audio time is I love social audio now. So I love Twitter Spaces. I listen to Google, Clubhouse and sometimes LinkedIn Live, and I've gone to like some podcasts. Sometimes they're guests that I've had on, and then I say, oh, that's really a good podcast, I have to listen to that. So I like that. So sort of if my time is precious, when I'm listening, I want to listen to social audio or a podcast and not a book, because partly after the pandemic, I'm driving less, I'm going less places, so I'm not in the car, which is when I would think to listen to social, to a book, let's say. So I do like, I've read on my iPad and stuff, but I kind of like the physical. I find that if I want to, check something or see where it was, it's a lot easier than to go, to go back in my book, or even put a place mark there. Like if it's a book that I'm reading because I'm going to interview a guest, like this is a scientist, Cassandra Quave, who wrote a book called The Plant Hunter, and she's an ethnobiologist, I think. But she looks at the study of plants and how they can help us, and she has a lab in NIH funded lab at Emory. So I want to be able to say, oh well, that's really interesting, let me ask her. So that's sort of particular. And what I do love to read, I guess that question, I love to read fiction. So I don't know, when I was like 16, I'd go to the library and I'd say, Vanity Fair, that sounds familiar. Take it out of the library. I had no idea really what it was. And, I love to read the Russian writers, in translation, the Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. So I love great literature. I love great writing. One of the writers I love is Elizabeth Strout, who's a Canadian. I think she's American, but her stories, a lot of them are in like around Ottawa and the country, and she's a beautiful style of writing. And so I really appreciate good writing and learning about new countries or history. And I do read for like here's a book, Limitless, which is like empowerment, and by Laura Gassner Otter, who is a guest, and I love that. I like that. But I think if I'm really going to read for pleasure, for me it's a fiction, and I like poetry as well, because I find that if it's particular, like the same lessons I might get from a book like Limitless, I love to get it in a novel, seeing the character and the specifics of how they have lived their life.
So it seems it's a nice blended mix then. There's obviously reading for pleasure, and there's poetry flowing through. There's reading up on people that you're going to interview for your own show and audio things that you're involved in. So that's a nice mix, and thank you for sharing some of those books with me. The other question I want to ask you, Rose, is obviously throughout this journey we've been talking about, you must have met people who've inspired you along the way, or people that you've admired. And when I ask you that question, what springs to mind? Is it a particular personality type or a particular person that springs to mind?
I think people who are really smart and strategic sometimes in their thinking, like this managing editor that I worked with at, when I did the investigative story, because he saw like, okay, let's cut to the chase. Let's see if this is a story, let's pursue this. Let's give it our all. And if nothing comes of it, nothing comes of it. But, people who say, I'm going to do it, I'm going to just start it. myself when I was doing producing during the pandemic on a daily show about live stream, daily consecutive 250 episodes, right? And then I did a medical show, and I'd never done producing. And then people said, well, why don't you do your own show? And I was like, and then I did, because then you just have to start it, you just do it, you do the thing and you get better at it. And I think that's really important. And then there's sort of the wisdom that I have. I do write poetry, and I've been lucky enough to stay good friends with a poet, late poet, Marie Ponceau. And she has 7 children. She supported herself raising the kids, translating French fables into, fairy tales. And she was like one of the Beats in a way. She was published by City Lights, but then she had 7 kids. And then she started to teach and write. She didn't get famous like until she was in her 80s. She won a National Book Prize, for a book. And then she was written, about in the Times at 88. And then, and she lived to 98. And one thing she said to me, she was in my house and I just had 2 babies. And I said, I have no furniture. Look at this house. She said, what do you need furniture? Look back, are you going to be rich? And I said, rich? And she said, rich with your life, rich with your life. So, remembering those moments, like when you're thinking of things, well, am I going to look back and say, well, did I want this piece of furniture, or did I want to make sure my kids had a passion and were learning and had all opportunities. And those are the things. And my own daughter asked me some questions last night. She's, moving ahead with her boyfriend. And I said, well, think about what you want to remember when you're 80. And somebody once said that to me. And also this, poet looking, what makes you rich? What does rich mean?
Yeah. That's lovely advice. Thank you for sharing those with us, Rose. I do like those. And then the other question I've got is about not just inspiration and motivation, but just building on that advice, because you're kind of touching on advice there. And there must be advice that you've been, whether it was back in your very early first beat, or was there anything that sort of stuck with you that you held on to that you thought that served me well through life? Or do you find yourself sharing a particular piece of advice with people?
I guess I'd say, trust yourself. Trust yourself. I wrote a piece after I had, when I got on Twitter, and then, I did that short video thing with the poet, but then in 2018, I put out a tweet that went viral, which was using Women to Follow, with the idea that, I used Women to Follow and said, can you name, and it was after I'd read an article about the bias in journalism, how many reporters, men reporters retweeted other men, and also women did that too. And I put out a tweet like, let's get this party started. I'm going to name 3 women to follow. And then, I went to the library, my feed was crazy, right? And it became, it went viral. But, the thing is, when I look back on it, I said, look what I've done. I planted this garden. When I was 10, I did the Horowitz family newspaper. When I was 16, I found this poster I had made, a collage of a scale, and I cut out pictures of men and women, and they were equal. It's like, wow, I was thinking about this at 16, So, when you're looking at your passion, think back, how did this get here? Because that then drives you forward. And it tells you, and you can trust yourself, and you don't have to ask a million people, what do you think I should do next? Like, look in yourself, look at what your strengths are, look at where your passion is, and go with that.
Love that. That's great advice. And I suppose the other thing I want to just touch on before we run out of time is your social media today, your social audio today, your own show. Whether it's supporting women in technology or Women to Follow that you sort of talked about when those things kind of took off, went viral. But could you maybe just share just a moment or two just about what you're involved in today, because you are very active in those sort of spaces right now?
Yeah, I'm really active in trying in a few things, but one is amplifying in amplifying women's voices on social media. I try to do it when I'm in Twitter spaces, or and be the woman who speaks and be the woman who points out when I see there's a space with 10 speakers and they might be all men, or 8 out of 9 of them are men, and say, hey, and nicely, like, hey, because I think you have to count, and you do have to count, because you need to raise awareness that women's voices need to be heard, and that whereas men in audio space might be just perfectly fine interrupting and just blasting out what they want to say and getting into an argument, maybe women aren't going to do that as much, but they have something to say. And if you don't open the room and make them feel comfortable to speak, then they're not going to speak. And it's just not the way, we're 50% of the world. We have to take up more space than we are now.
What about your own show, Rose?
My own show, before I did the show, I did written profiles of like 17 women. But once I got the broadcasting experience and the fun of live stream and social audio, I said, hey, this is another way to reach people, another medium. And so I love it, because I meet fantastic women, and I get to see, how they're, one woman, she's a law professor. Now she hosts the Ms. podcast, and I think that and I get good traction because people see that I'm doing something that is amplifying women and doing it in a public and positive way. It's not like I'm calling out all the men who are 8 on the panel. Usually it's saying, here are the positive things these women are doing, let's hear about them, let's know about them. And that it's more people like who are leaders in their field. So they might be a leader in AR, they might be a leader in AI, they might be, a leader in, I interviewed a deaf woman who wrote a book about, growing up, what it was like to grow up deaf, a novel. So, really expanding and amplifying women's voices. And what I hope to do, one thing I'll wait for you to ask me that question for next year, for this year. Sorry.
Well, it's fine, because I mean, what you're talking about there is it's so important. Like, we've seen it, I've seen it, from being involved in a lot of events over the years, that, making sure the panels, the speakers, that they're balanced, that there's a cross section of views, there's a diversity to what we're doing. And, you're talking about that at the very sort of fundamental level. If you're in social audio and it's just, there is no other voices there. It's a one-sided discussion, and
right, it's going to be
only
less
by
rich.
Including others that you actually have a more meaningful discussion. So
right, and it's going to be a much richer discussion.
Yeah,
right.
For sure. Yeah. But yeah, the question that we'll come back to then, that I do want to definitely ask you, is, as you go forward and you think about the next 6 months or the next 12 months, what's taking up the mental capacity? What are you thinking about? What's on the forefront of your mind, Rose?
Well, I guess in the near future and for 2023 is to in March, there's Women's History Month, and there's Women's History, an International Day, Women's International Day on March 8th. And so I'm thinking about planning a summit, a Women to Follow summit, that will look at possibly women in the world, women's impact in the world, in places like what women are doing in Iran, what women are doing in Ukraine, what women are doing in Afghanistan, and look at that. And then look at that how women are leading democracy, not only in the world, but how they're empowering themselves in other ways, like in tech, so that with women in Web3, for example, this is a new, it's new, but women who are embracing it are going to get ahead and are going to, it's sort of democratization of, in the same way that Web 2 was, that people could get on Twitter and get their voices heard. I think the same thing will be for Web 3. And a difference for Web 3 is this concept of ownership. So that in Web 2, if I'm dependent on Twitter to amplify me and something goes, they something, it falls apart, or they decide they don't like my voice, well, I have other places to go. And if I go on the blockchain and I write something, or I do my podcast on the blockchain, I own that. And I don't have to be dependent. Also, like a newspaper goes out of business, where, I can't find some of my stories because they've gone out of business and they don't maintain an archive. So I think it's important so I want to look at that as and I'm looking at doing a summit because I think it would be a good place and a flagship maybe for my show. And then also writing, I think I have a book in me. So like about me, possibly a memoir, or possibly, looking at some of the women that I have come to know.
Well, Rose, if you don't have a book in you, none of us have a chance at writing a book. So, I mean, that's definitely has to happen. And I love the idea of the summit. I think that's such a great idea. That would be fantastic. Yeah, I love that. I suppose the last thing I want to ask you then is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to share with our audience? And also, if people want to find out more about all the things that you're involved in, or maybe just keep tags so they can catch up with the summit later this year. Yeah. Where are you sending people to, Rose? Where's the best people to go to find out more information?
I think the best place to go right now, as long as it's here, is Twitter. I'm most active on Twitter, but I'm active on LinkedIn, and my show, Women to Follow, my broadcast, my show is, I use StreamYard, and it goes 4 places. So it goes to my LinkedIn account, my Facebook account, my Twitter account, and I have my own YouTube channel. So I'd love for people to find my YouTube channel, because all my, 28 interviews with, 35 women are there. But I'm always putting, like, if you look at my pin tweet, is always about what the latest thing I'm involved with. Either I've just done it, or I've put clips out, something a guest just said in our conversation. So, and my website is always has my latest video on it, and a link to my Medium account, which has my writing. So I'm on Medium under my name everywhere, Rose Horowitz, Rose Horowitz 31. And my website is Woman to Follow with hyphens. And so those are the best places. And as far as my summit, I'm thinking about how to do this as maybe a webinar or Eventbrite, and building more of a community is a goal that I have this year, because the same idea that I want people to know where I am, and I feel I have a community. I don't have one like specifically on like Twitter, but I'm sort of not so, I don't know how that's going to go. So trying to figure out what the best path is. But I think that holding a summit like this, and people would be signing up, and I want to get women in the world. I want it to get more well known, because I feel like I've got a lot of wisdom with my own, but so much that I'm sharing. I want the world to know about that more, and for it to be more visible.
Well, that sounds like a great year ahead, Rose. You've got a lot of work, but it sounds great. So people can obviously follow you at Rose Horowitz 31 on Twitter. Yes, that's your @ name. And obviously Women to Follow on the website. Obviously you're on LinkedIn. And to check out your Medium too, and also your YouTube channel, because obviously you're streaming out to 3 or 4 places as well. Those great discussions that you're having. So that brings me nicely to the end of today's episode with Rose. So Rose, thank you so much for being a guest here on the Global Discussion. Thanks to everybody who's watching or listening to us around the world. I certainly appreciate it. And make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, do all the things that you do with podcasts. We'd like that. And I hope that you join me back here again. Well, I'll be having more conversations with creatives, leaders, and thinkers from all around the world. Thank you, Rose. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My honor, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose.